Thank you and welcome to another episode of Debate in Lund. All of you that have come here tonight to Grand Hotel, and of course also all of you who are following us on the live stream. My name is Lars Mogensen and I'm a radio journalist. Debate in Lund is, as some of you know, it's in an area organized by Lund University where we bring together and invite writers, thinkers, researchers, academics, and believe it or not, sometimes even people from outside the academic world to deepen our common knowledge and discuss key topics of our time. These talks are made possible by the Faculty of Social Sciences, so thank you to them. Tonight, with a war going on in the Middle East, or several wars, with a war in Ukraine, we're asking whether Europe is facing some kind of twilight, whether we are witnessing the twilight of Europe, some sort of sundown, whether Europe's role and its tradition of liberal democracy, free press, independent legal systems, liberal rights, whether this is losing somehow its global attractiveness or its appeal at a time when many other countries around the world instead turn to authoritarian leaders or even to dictatorship. According to one of the most credible global sources on the state and the health of democracy, the VDEM Institute at Gothenburg University, democracy is now down to 1978 levels for the global average citizen. And only 7% of the world population live in liberal democracies like we do in Sweden. So liberal democracy is not the rule, if it ever was, but it has definitely become the exception to the rule. And so what does this mean? What does this mean to the future of Europe? That's one of our questions. And we have four excellent guests here tonight helping us to put this into perspective. We have Tabitha Rosendahl. She's a lecturer at Lund University with expertise on Chinese international relations and China's political global influence at the Center for East and Southeast Asian Studies. Martin Gelin, author, journalist, now living in Paris. You've been working for many years and living in New York. Writing for Dagens, Nyheter, the Swedish newspaper, and also for The Guardian, The Washington Post, and others. And Martin's latest book, Rules of Attraction, Why Soft Power Matters in Hard Times. In Swedish, it's mjuk makt, kultur och propaganda i den nya världsordningen. It touches upon issues that we're talking about here tonight. Maria Georgieva, journalist, longtime Russia correspondent for Svenska Dagbladet. She's also an investigative reporter for Swedish television, Uppdrag granskning. And she also writes for The Guardian and other newspapers. So, many different types of work. And Ian Manners, our local academic, a professor in political science here at Lund University and an expert on the concept of normative power of the European Union. We will be talking about that later. So another little hand for this nice group. Before we go into hard and soft things, I just came to think of, imagine if Europe was not a continent. It was not a continent. And imagine if the European Union was not a political entity. Imagine if Europe was just some sort of idea. What kind of idea, Tabitha, would that be?
Well, I suppose it would be technically, or in theory, maybe the idea of liberal democracy. But at least from the Chinese point of view, it would be more about fundamental divergences of opinion, fragmentation and diversity that can lead to this kind of lack of consensus.
So from a Chinese perspective, it would be fragmentation. Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll get back to that. Martin, the idea of Europe.
Yeah, I moved back here 2 years ago, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that and kind of traveling around Europe and I think it's it used to be a question that bored people. Now I think it's an incredibly vital question, and it excites people, and maybe worries people too. What remains of Europe as an idea? What remains of the EU as an idea? And I think, as Tabita said, like the idea of liberal democracy and the more as an ideal than as maybe always a lived example in political practice. But I think it can kind of be boiled down to Raymond Aron's idea of like self-criticism and skepticism, and the kind of post-1945 understanding that we are capable of absolutely horrible things, and so we need to have rules in order to restrain those potentially bad things, and that requires a constant process of self-criticism.
Thank you, Martin. And Maria, with your perspective, or when you try to boil down the European idea, what do you see?
I thought I was going to say something about movement and freedom and link into what Tabata and Martin said, but I want to give it a Moscow lens, which is that Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, they took a bit of cherry picking from old Europe. They took science, they took enlightenment and created some kind of absolutism in Russia. They didn't want the soft power or the core individual values about human rights and stuff. So I would say that a mirror, an idea of mirrors that Putin is still somehow looking into, seeing Europe and then deciding to completely go in the opposite direction and say, Europe, for me, that is cathedrals and churches and nice ideas about everything that is not regarding LGBT or so-called gay Europe, all of those things that are very popular in Russian media.
So he can pick certain things.
He picks what he wants. Mm-hmm. He wants the science and the enlightenment, but doesn't want the core individual rights.
We'll hear more about that. And Ian Manners, the idea, if Europe was an idea.
Yeah, I have two answers to that.
Okay.
I'm going to go with answer one, which is the way people normally respond, and then answer two, the way I think. Answer one, I think, is if Europe was an idea, yes, you would have, and this is the roots of the normative power approach, you would have ideas such as sustainable peace, the absence of war from the continent since 1945, apart from Yugoslavia and Ukraine. Answer related to that, human rights, rule of law, the role of democracy. You can add in freedom, solidarity, equality, a desire to address the climate apocalypse that awaits us. And that would be a sort of a very European view of, what makes Europe us, in addition to, obviously, the comments we've heard so far. But there's a really important reflection that we need to do, and this is particularly coming from the United Kingdom as a British citizen, that, basically imposed these sorts of things on other people very unevenly. In 1961, Frantz Fanon, the liberation psychologist, wrote that Europe is the creation of the third world. Everything that we are, every glorious component of the country, the land, the region we live in, is a result of our relationship with the rest of the world. So my personal answer to that is, what's the idea of Europe? It is sharing. We share everything we have in some way or another. We're going to talk about the United States. When Christopher Columbus, wherever he came from, arrived to the United States, he arrived there with the help of a compass. Where did the compass come from? It came from China. All of our science, much of our language, much of our knowledge of who we are in the world has been taken, borrowed, and shared with the rest of the world. We mustn't forget this sharing, or as I term it, a type of communion. sharing with other people. And it's not common to hear people say this out loud, but we must, because
it's a more humble way of looking at oneself.
I think so. We've got to share this planet for the rest of our lives, and that's important.
You mentioned normative power, and we've been hearing the concept soft power as well. But normative power is a concept that you came up with when you started studying the European Union before it even became the European Union back in the 1990s. And what does it mean saying that Europe or the European Union has some kind of normative power?
Yeah, sure. So I witnessed the fall of the communist bloc firsthand, working for the BBC in 1989 and 1990. And I sort of said to myself, what on earth does this mean for the EC? You know, and there was a lot of talk of, well, this is the end of the EC, because it was only there as a balance against the communist bloc. So I studied it to try and understand what happened, and a lot of new policies came. A lot of countries wanted to join the EU, as they do today. Okay, and I thought, what is it? This power that we're seeing, you know, and people like Joe Nye had terms like soft power or hard power, and I thought, no, it's something more. It's something about what is the right direction to head in. So formally, I determine normative power. The idea of normative power is the ability to shape normal. The problem, or the challenge today, is you can read books on normative power China, normative power USA.
Yeah, because being a normative is just saying that you expect or want somebody else to do so.
That's right, yeah. And I think the idea of the normative power of the EU has an attraction. Let's say over the last 5 years, practically every academic in the UK and the USA wants to come here. You know, so there's some sort of attraction at work, even amongst the intellectual elite of the world. But I've added an additional twist to this in the context of the climate crisis. The ability to define normal for the planetary good. And this relates to sharing, that if we are to survive the planetary crisis, we have to think about everybody. And is that purely European? No, it's not. This opinion is shared across the planet.
Does this make sense to you? Sounds good? All right. Interesting. Since we have Tabitha with your expertise on China, and we have Maria with your expertise on Russia, I'd like to hear a little bit, like from the outside, Tabitha, if we look at this Europe with its normative power, with its churches, its cathedrals, its history,
its universities,
what does Europe look like, or what is Europe seen from a Chinese perspective?
I mean, generally speaking, we can say that Europe looks like two things, very distinct things at the same time. It looks like an opportunity and it looks like a challenge. And so in terms of an opportunity, China still sees that Europe is an important market. It's still an important export destination. It's still an important place for Chinese investments. And so you have this very strong propensity for Chinese companies to want to go here, to want to, invest themselves, to expand their portfolios, and so on and so forth. And of course, Europe can also be used as a type of sort of middle in the sandwich that is China, Europe, and the US, right? So there's also this view that somehow, if you kind of break down some of these, or at least if you try to shift some of these coalitions that are in the EU framework, then you can also try to stop this containment effort from the US. So China views the EU, generally speaking, very much as part of the West, which is, of course, not really a good thing. But at the individual level, European countries are also very much working with China, and they're very interested in, diversifying their investments also with China and against China. So there's this kind of contention there. But now we also see a different reality, which is that we see a China that has been, at least in the European mind, flooding the market with, for example, electric vehicles, these cheap goods, a China that has gotten more and more powerful in terms of, for example, rare earth control, the upstreaming of minerals, and all of these types of things. So we see a Europe that is increasingly sort of trying to counteract maybe in my view at least a little bit too little too late, but they're trying to catch up in a sense. And so this new Made in Europe plan just came out, very recently, which is essentially a bid or a sort of reframing of this investment screening regime that is very much targeting Chinese companies. So again, China views this as a very direct sort of hit on its interests, and China is very interested in sort of either retaliating against this or at least trying to mitigate this by saying, well, you can no longer trust the US. So we are now the shoulder that you can cry on, Europe and individual European countries. We're here for you. We're the new reliable partner. We're the new reliable sort of world hegemon, right? So that's also this kind of...
The game has changed there.
Exactly.
They're trying to use it.
And Trump has really done China a huge favor, once again.
Okay, yeah, interesting. And Maria, if I ask you the same question, but Europe seen from Moscow, from a Russian perspective. I know there's not one Chinese or one Russian perspective, but still, from Moscow, what do they see?
Well, first of all, they do like to cry on a certain shoulder, speaking of China. But I want to start by mentioning the years I lived in Russia. There was a shift from being very anti-US. I saw with Trump coming into power the first time, many Russians, not only Moscow and politicians and the chinovniki, people from the elite or the government, but also ordinary Russians, started to becoming much more anti-European. You see Europe as an existential threat. Speaking of this mirror I mentioned briefly before, you look in the mirror and you want to see an extension of Russia into Europe, but you see isolation. You see sanctions that are imposed to bring down your economy and your way of life. You do not want to struggle and suffer for and constantly think about survival, which is the game now. It's about surviving. This existential threat is posed to everybody being a part of the Russian propaganda. I say everybody because the propaganda it's all-consuming into people's lives, into their kitchens. The TV channels are on, not only now, of course, there's an internet crackdown, but everybody's affected by the Russian propaganda. And in the Russian propaganda, the only values that exist in Europe are that we're so... we want migration, we want everybody to be homosexual. Those are it's like a caricature of what Europe could be, and that is the Russian view of what Europe is. Mm-hmm. So when I said cherry picking before, is that you want to choose the values or the businesses you cooperate with. You do not want to be sanctioned because of the war in Ukraine, but you also you want to be accepted. Putin one day, a very long time ago, declared that he didn't want to be misunderstood by Europe, and then he was just isolated. This was before the Munich conference in 2008, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. And this is something that has shaped his worldview ever since. He doesn't want to be isolated and constantly think about survival, but that is what he's doing. At the same time, Russia is profiting out of European energy market and the gas sector. So
both in the Chinese case and for Russia, there are things to cherry pick that are interesting and nice and attractive. But when it comes to liberal rights or democracy or women's rights or freedom of press, there is not really anything that's worth trying. Ian, you've been in Denmark and Sweden for many years, but you were born in Britain, so now you'll be the ambassador of that part of the world. When London looks at Brussels or when London looks at the European Union, what is Europe then? Yeah,
I think there was a long-building perception, I think really brought in by Margaret Thatcher in the late 1970s, that Europe and the EU was Britain's problem. It's what weakened the UK. And you see, despite being present at the creation of the single market in the 1980s, you see this kind of growing, I would call it xenophobia, to be honest, that whatever was going on wrong in Britain, industrial strife, unemployment, rising poverty, shortening lives, child poverty. The fault was coming from the rest of Europe, or in their minds, Europe. And this hasn't changed. And a lot of very wealthy people decide that the way to change this was to leave the EU. There is no expert on the EU that would have agreed with that proposition. And the problem today is it's really hard to turn around that Titanic. So despite the fact that pretty much every politician is now, as they were prior to Brexit, agreed that Europe wasn't the problem was internal, and it was to do with, let's say, post-imperial practices within the UK, which weaken it as an economy, as a society. None of these are being addressed. And so the view still, I think, generally from the UK is, oh, if only they'd let us have trade market access, or if only they'd let us have greater access to the financial services, you know, why are they being so hard on us? It sounds like Putin talking, right? Oh, we just want to be loved, you know.
Just like anybody.
Yeah, we had a divorce, why can't we come back occasionally for a bit of love, you know? So it's absurd, and it's misinformed systematically, I would say, by some of the poor expertise, politicians, and even far-right journalism in the UK.
It's interesting to hear. And Martin, in your case, I'm not asking you to be the ambassador of any country, but it's interesting with your own experience, having lived so long in the US, and then you, for private or family reasons and other things, decided to go back to Europe. Why that, and what are you seeing when you look at Europe today?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we've been moved back for a combination of, I mean, the political reasons that are tied to family reasons in a way. I mean, yeah, we moved in 2024, and America didn't, before the election, but yeah, the direction of American politics didn't look very promising at the time. We were attracted here, as you were saying, you know, a lot of Americans want to move to Europe right now. And it's this sort of paradox, I think, in America, where you have Trump and J.D. Vance and the MAGA movement who are obsessed with Europe, as they kind of see it as their last obstacle, last kind of democratic obstacle in a way. You know, it's this very uncomfortable example of a continent that is doing relatively well with different values and the ones that they are promoting, and they want to diminish that power, the soft power of Europe.
When you say, I mean, it sounds crazy and normal at the same time. When you say that the President of the United States and its Minister of Foreign Affairs are seeing Europe as the last obstacle, democratic obstacle, it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, a lot of geopolitical analysts talk about this as the biggest geopolitical shift since 1989, and you know, we'll see how long it lasts. But it's hard. I think it took way too long for a lot of Europeans to understand that Trump is serious about cutting transatlantic relations. But on the other hand, we have this. You know, Europe's soft power is still incredibly strong, and it still attracts people from all over the world, and it still attracts Americans. And I was just on the train from Stockholm. It was full of retired Americans who were like so excited to be here, and a young gay couple, also American, who were also so excited to be here. And I'm walking around Lund, and there's American students everywhere. And you know, there's this huge split in America where the conservatives, the far right, despise Europe, often with completely erroneous notions of what it is. They think Sweden is a, like, you know, oppressive statist society without freedoms and private ownership, you know, whatever. But then there are like, you know, half of America, progressive America, liberal America sees Europe as a utopia, and you know, there's statistics on I think about 200% increase in European tourism to Europe in the past 2 years, and massive, obviously, increases in applications for scientists and
But there have been Russian tourists previously in Europe too, seeing Europe as a wonderful place, just like American tourists.
Oh yeah, Russians know much more about Sweden and Europe than we know about them, that's for sure. And that's something that we're not going to see in the near future because of the political situation. And of course, that's not my case as a journalist to talk about that, but there are many ordinary exiled Russians that do not have the same ability to travel freely, and that maybe need the protection also of European institutions in a way that, because they can afford it, but also because we have a lot of restrictions following the war of Ukraine. So, and Putin is also using all of these threats that Europe has, existential threats, to just show the Russian people that he's still a strong man. He's using it for his own approval ratings. So that's a big thing to add in this discussion.
And the Chinese students, visitors, tourists, do they come here for studying or the Eiffel Tower, or is there a serious interest in some kind of European way of life? I mean, democracy-wise.
I mean, there's certainly a huge interest. There's a lot of Chinese students that come here to, of course, study at some of our great universities, and this is across Europe. So, and I mean, it's not to say that, I mean, China's ranking much higher internationally in terms of universities right now. If you have been following the news, you'll know this. But still, there's a huge attraction. There's a lot of Chinese young people, especially, that want to come here, that want to study here, that want to engage, that want to learn a different way of life, and also, coincidentally, very often want to learn more about China from a European point of view. So kind of want to look and re-examine, in a sense, their own country, but just from a different perspective that they can't necessarily get at home. Now, this is not always the case for all Chinese students, of course. People come here for all types of reasons, but there is still a huge attraction, and this idea of going to Europe and ingraining yourself in a different type of society, in a different type of openness, different types of values, different types of ideals, that is certainly there. The CCP, of course, is not necessarily always very interested in this type of exchange, but neither are our governments, I should add, because we're seeing securitization across the board. So exchanges of Chinese students and also our students going to China is being defunded, it's being cut down. So many of these exchange programs are now being run into the ground because we're afraid of what our students are going to learn in China, whether they will be instrumentalized against us, these types of things. So security issues, geopolitics, play a huge role in this, and also in terms of the general attractiveness that a country like Sweden has for Chinese. I mean, it's not to say that tourists don't come here, they're very happy to. But there is this propensity again, now with more and more security issues, and again, this securitization of research, of collaboration across universities, we're seeing this kind of very stark cutback of all the types.
What does that do to Europe if they, in the interchange and going back and forth for students to China, is diminishing?
Well, this is the opposite of sharing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think the greatest risk to Europe in the short term is this ideology of securitization, of closure, of borders, of risk. And it's a hot selling potato. There are far-right parties across Europe that want to make Europe great again. And that does involve closing borders, killing or sending migrants back to where they fled from. And this is a terrible cost and risk, not just to them, but to us. I went and studied when I was a bachelor's student in the United States. And I didn't understand Europe till I went to the United States. I do now. But I think that form of exchange, whether it is Russians or Ukrainians or Chinese or Taiwanese or Europeans or Americans, is extraordinarily important. And it is part of coming to understand not just Europe, but the world and the challenges that it faces. And I think the agenda of the far right is a product of failed economic thinking in the 1980s and 1990s. But its cost is it's making our economy more risk exposed in the broadest sense. So I think we need to get back to this idea that unless we can actively share and be more open, then we're actually making our societies more vulnerable, not more strong.
But fear and insecurity is something that's spreading among people, isn't it? And it's being used.
It's something that's being spread amongst people.
Yeah.
Is Europe an insecure place? And this is what MAGA would like you to think. No, it's not. And there are many places in the world which are wonderful places to visit, to live. So we have to be very careful of who's telling these stories. And this was the story in the United Kingdom. You know, that every problem in the UK was coming from the EU. You ended migration, and what did you wind up with? A chronic labour shortage, a chronic shortage of students. You tried to plug it with Asian students. It's not worked. 40% of universities in the UK are in the red. They are on the way out. You know, and this is the prime employment sector in the United Kingdom.
Martin, your book on mjuk makt, soft power on hard times. Just a brief explanation. Soft power, I'm thinking of art, culture, education, but could it be anything? What is soft power?
Yeah, I mean, it's the term was coined in 1989 by Joseph Nye, as Ian mentioned, to kind of distinguish, you know, hard power is economic power, military power, measurable forms of power that you can use as force. Soft power is sort of non-violent forms of power to influence the world. And it became, I think, in the 90s, it became, you know, it was a very optimistic time in the West. So it became primarily associated with this kind of expansion of democracy and trade, free trade, free minds, the kind of neoliberal mindset that Joseph Nye was, you know, himself an example of. And the reason I wanted to write the book now, and the reason I think it's relevant, and also very relevant in a European context, is that I think today it's not just about trade and tourism and economic gains from, you know, exporting music or something like that. It's about survival. You know, Ukraine is an example of that. They use their soft power to. They are using their soft power to.
In what sense? How?
I mean, if we contrast, and Maria could probably talk more in detail about this as well. I mean, if we contrast 2014 and the annexation of Crimea to the 2022 invasion of Crimea of Ukraine. There's been tremendous effort by Ukraine in that window to increase their soft power, and it was quite successful. So we saw, you know, the weeks after the invasion in 2022, this massive outpouring of support for Ukraine, and it's been mostly sustained despite Trump's, you know, efforts to curtail it. Ukraine, I mean, Europe is now has almost made up for the funds that America is no longer sending in aid to Ukraine, and that's because Ukraine has a lot of soft power, and it's because they are able to convince European governments to keep helping them. So, you know, they're defending themselves with hard power, with military power, but they are the conditions to sustain that effort is completely dependent on soft power. And this is really, I think this is a really important lesson for from young democracies. You know, like the countries that are spending a lot on diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, on culture and arts in general, is Eastern European countries, Baltic states, Eastern Asian countries, the neighbors of China, Taiwan, South Korea. They know what it's like to have a dictator next door. And in Europe, we take our democracy and our peace for granted, and our elections are still about, you know, I was just in Denmark before the election, and you would think after the Greenland crisis that there would be an election about geopolitics and, you know, the new world order, but it was an election about pig farming and cocaine abuse by some local politician and, you know, provincial matters. I think Europe really needs to wake up and learn from what these younger democracies in East Asia.
Yeah, because in your book you mentioned not only Ukraine and South Korea with its K-pop, etc. You also mentioned the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, not exactly democracies, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. They are very much focusing on soft power, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's, this very wealthy, the Emirates, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia are spending the most money in the world on culture and art. Saudi Arabia, they started to build 600 new art museums in this Vision 2030. They lowered the number a little bit now because of the Iran war is limiting their assets, but. These three authoritarian regimes are making massive investments, and
the Louvre has a showcase in, what is it, Dubai?
In Abu Dhabi, yeah, and they also had Art Basel, one of the most prestigious art fairs, open in Qatar, and in Paris, where I live, there you see everywhere all the big art institutions are getting funding from these states, and I think it's. They would, and they're doing this. They're hiring the smartest, most expensive PR consultants from London and Berlin and Paris and New York and California, and they come to the Gulf states and they get insane amounts of money and they create these narrative strategies and soft power strategies, and they've been incredibly successful.
But when you're
not doing it.
Yeah, but when you're looking at Europe, if I understand you right, Europe has some sort of bad self-confidence, or I mean, when it comes to soft power and our history and our democratic values, we are not taking care of them the way Saudi Arabia is using their soft power.
Yeah, there's a strange combination, I think. Coming back here, as you said, I had to move to the US to understand Europe. Very much felt the same. I was away for 23 years, and I come back, and it's. I did an interview with the author Sadie Smith right before I moved, and she also moved. She's British, but she lived in New York for a long time, and then she moved back to London because it's easier to have a family there. And she said, even everyone's complaining about, the British welfare state is not as good as it used to be, but she said, even the crumbs of the NHS is better than what we had in America, and to me, it seems, I don't want to minimize the problems that Europe is facing, but especially the French, they're the best in the world at complaining about a society that is, by all, most people who go to France, it's not so bad. And not just because they have nice pastries, if you look at the metrics, it's doing okay. I think most of Europe is, and also to Ian's point about openness, we're risking this by closing our borders and deporting people and being obsessed with this paranoia, and it's not a coincidence that Hungary under Orban has been one of the least successful economies in Europe, and Spain under Sanchez is right now one of the most successful ones. And if you go back in history, it's the ability to absorb ideas from all over the world, sometimes with terrible, colonialist methods, but sometimes with more benign methods that has made Europe great. And
right.
There's a great book by Josephine Quinn. I think she's a historian at Oxford, called "How the World Made the West," and I think that's a great term to kind of understand Europe. It's not just Europe shaping the world. We were also shaped by the world.
Tabitha, when you look at Europe, also thinking about what Martin just said, maybe a lack of self-confidence to some extent, and Europe is a difficult organization. It's scattered. It's the political union. Is there a stronger self-confidence in the Chinese party and the Chinese state than there is in Europe, would you say?
I mean, absolutely. But I think this is also, there's two reasons for this. One, China thinks that Europe has been resting on its laurels for too long, and this is why Europe is in decline, right? So it's not even about a lack of self-confidence. It's a lack of trying, essentially, that China is seeing. So that's also why now we've basically had this kind of very long period, especially since Xi Jinping took over in 2012, that China's foreign policy has become much more assertive. China has been integrating itself in the world much more prominently. Across the board, we're talking huge investments under the Belt and Road Initiative. We're talking massive, not just infrastructure, but also investments in health, in building up local schools, like giving school supplies and all of these types of things. And I think China has come to the realization that not just because of its own economy, but also because of how the world works, right? You can't just have this hard coercive power. You can't just have these economic instruments, coercive instruments, and so on and so forth. You need to have something soft. And that is exactly what Xi Jinping has identified now. This is exactly what the Communist Party is trying to do. And they're doing this in a very concerted way. So you have these 4 global initiatives in China, right? You have the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and now the Global Civilization Initiative. And all of these initiatives have one thing in common. They combine economic investments. They combine these types of normal sort of spreading of power and influence and so on and so forth. But they also really focus on soft power, building up China's influence in terms of showcasing Chinese values. And what are Chinese values, of course, is a thing we could also discuss for a few hours. But the point is, China is essentially trying to portray itself as a much better, much more, a better alternative to whatever it is Washington is trying to sell, whatever it is any other country is trying to sell. And it's doing this by promoting its own values, non-interference, multilateralism, sort of sovereign equality, these types of things. But also different types of values that should be questioned, right? Democracy. Can there be one type of democracy? China says no. We have consultative democracy. That's also democracy, but it's just with Chinese conditionalities. We have different type of human rights. We have all of these things. Europe cannot just impose these values on us. Washington cannot just impose these values on us. There's not just one way of being normative. Now we are seeing that China is actively influencing global governance regimes in order to show there's different types of conceptualizations of these things. One good example is, I don't know if you've come across this, but democracy is not Coca-Cola. It's an actual slogan from the Chinese Communist Party. And what this is trying to say is essentially just that. Democracy isn't one thing that is produced by one country and transported. True. But it's not just one thing that is, transported one-to-one from one country to the next. So Coca-Cola is the same, no matter where in the world you go, right? There's one recipe, there's one exporter, well, maybe there's sub-exporters, but you know what I mean. China is essentially saying, this is not how democracy works. We need to conceptualize democracy based on local conditions, local histories, local socioeconomic, circumstances and these types of things. And this is exactly the type of thing that China is trying to do now. Reorient the rules of the game, recentering itself, and showing that there's different types of conceptualizations of norms and values and ideals.
And this brings us back to our first question. I mean, with the enormous self-confidence and the force that China is using, both hard power and soft power, Russia cherry-picking whatever he wants, are we seeing some kind of twilight for Europe? Is this Europe's twilight? Is anybody listening when we speak about democracy or gay rights or children's rights, or what do you say, Ian?
Yeah. Again, 2 answers. Let's take the mainstream conversation. We have entered a geopolitical, geoeconomic landscape where big, great powers are leading the way: China, India, Russia, USA. In that landscape, it is the twilight of the EU. It is the twilight of Europe. Because we are not a big power. And we remember being big powers and the extremely negative consequences.
Is that a problem, us remembering our history, thinking ourselves
I think it is, and I think it should be, particularly if you come from a colonial country. And there are many in Europe, including Russia. If you think that the world should be dominated by great powers, the new great powers, who currently make up about 40% of the world's population, then you've bought into a mindset which leads you to the twilight not just of Europe, but the twilight of humanity itself. Because none of these great powers are going to answer the very real challenges of catastrophic climate and ecological change that we face here and now. But if we can address these broader questions, we can realize that by the end of the century, if there is to be a humanity worth saving, the population of these countries will make up about 20% of the world's population. We have to look elsewhere for our European friends, not just at the great powers. Don't look to Washington or Beijing or New Delhi. Look elsewhere. Around the world, people know what's going on, particularly young people, particularly educated young people, particularly women, particularly minorities of all sorts. And they know that the great game is afoot again, as it was 100, 150 years ago. And playing the great game isn't going to make you a great power, and it's not going to help prevent the twilight of Europe. Europe stands a great chance, and the EU stands an even better chance of being part of this broader story, if we understand what the problems are, not just allowing other people to set the agenda. Don't just sit there and watch China News or Russia Today or CNN.
It's about finding new friends.
Absolutely. We have friends everywhere. Oh, that's from a movie, isn't it?
Maria, have you been thinking about that basic question for this evening? Is this the Europe's twilight?
I have, but I've also thought about how I think Ian puts it very well, that the climate change is not going to be solved in Russia. But what I want to add to that is that Russian disinformation, or Putin himself, is very good at putting himself into other leaders' mindsets and creating the threat from Russia, making it much bigger than it can actually be perceived as, which I find to be very complicated in the world we live in today, where we have to have the opportunity to question and to look at sourcing and also to understand Russia, to actually be able to read the news and see that, yes, there's still high support for the war in Ukraine, the economy is not going that well, sanctions are working, but also now, for example, Bulgaria got a new president that's called Europe's new, a new prime minister called Europe's new Orban, which I find to be completely wrong, because he's a former pro-Russian politician, and now Europe is supposed to crumble because Bulgaria is becoming the new Hungary. And I think that is one example of how Putin is able to somehow create this idea that he can create followers, or you can have proxies acting on behalf of Russia, the so-called hybrid warfare. We can also add to that by being
So are you saying
naive.
that you're saying that he's not just another Orban, he's even worse, so to speak?
No, I'm not saying that he is that, because I think he's still going to. Bulgaria is one of the biggest supporters of military aid to Ukraine, and I think that Bulgaria is going to continue to be so. I don't think that we've managed to ask all the questions to this new prime minister that needs to be asked before we perceive him as this threat. I think that many experts want us to have this angle, and newspapers have had that. I have background in Bulgaria, that's why this is something that hits to my core, but I don't want to talk too much about that, but that's a way of maybe thinking that the Kremlin has a lot of fans out there, when we actually have to question, why is that? Why are we naive? Russian espionage, we have to view that as a challenge, because that is a real threat, or sabotage, taking place on the railroads of Poland, where people are getting aid into Ukraine that are getting sabotaged. But all this proxy war that's going on at the same time is supposed to look very big, but is actually quite small.
And it seems like the lack of knowledge in Europe about Russia seems to be a big problem, the way I understand.
That's my message of the twilight, that the twilight doesn't have to be as dark if we can somehow learn to find the tools for that. And
Martin?
Yeah, no, I think it's really an important point that you're making about, this, I've written about this kind of inevitability narrative, like, the idea that the far right and the kind of enemies of freedom will just win all the elections, and we just need to kind of accommodate them and create some kind of like lighter version of that is the only alternative to sustain democracy.
And Putin is spreading that narrative, Trump is spreading that narrative, China is assisting pretty aggressively in spreading that narrative as well in Europe. And I mean, when Orban lost the election, I wrote a quick piece just saying that this is, the backlash to the backlash. The first backlash being, this kind of xenophobic nationalist backlash to liberal democracy. And some of my colleagues were like, "Oh, this is way too optimistic. We don't have any signs of a significant backlash yet to nationalism." And I mean, there is still a lot of nationalism out there. But we had the Hungary election. We have the referendum in Italy where Meloni was defeated on the courts, and there's a number of the election in the Netherlands, number of local elections around Europe that has been signs of resistance against this. And I think we have a kind of moral obligation as friends of democracy to highlight these examples instead of just leaning into these kind of easy narratives of hopelessness. There's almost a race among journalists who can be the most who can be the most pessimistic. No one wants to repeat the mistakes of underestimating Trump, and I think that makes people tune out and give up and stop being active in democratic movements. And so I think it's even though the nationalists and the far right are very, very powerful and they have the support of many of the richest people on the planet that will be around long after Trump is gone, there are also majorities or pluralities in most of these countries that are fighting this.
So you don't regret coming back to Europe?
No, I mean France is might elect a far-right government next year. It's people are like, oh, there's a far-right in France also, right? And I'm like, yeah, but tell me a country where I could move where that's not the case. But it's still. I think Europe is way too pessimistic about themselves. At the same time, paradoxically, as there is this sort of smugness about people don't understand how fragile democracy is and the stability of our peaceful societies are. I think that Europeans need to wake up and see that this is a beautiful place and we need to fight very, very hard to preserve this.
Okay. And Tabita, you're from Denmark originally, aren't you? So if you take your Chinese hat off and be a bit European, what do you think about this possible Europe's twilight?
I think, and this is from both a personal standpoint and slightly also a China scholar standpoint, I think there's two issues to this, right? So one, the EU and different European countries in general have been kind of following this action-reaction pattern for a very long time. There's a big country that does something, oh God, now we have to react, we have to do something too. And then very often this response is kind of a knee-jerk response. It's not always very thought through, or it's kind of haphazard, it's fragmented, it's some country implements some investment screening mechanism, then other countries try to do the same. And it's not necessarily something that actually works, it's not a concerted effort. So we often have this kind of dichotomy of, a country like China having 5-year plans, 25-year plans, 100-year plans, and then European countries having 1-month plans or 2-month plans, or, and this is not really a very sustainable way of working. So one example is you have the Belt and Road Initiative, and China has been buying influence. We all know that, right? Investments, huge economic investments, impetus in different types of infrastructure projects, for example. Europe conceptualized the Global Gateway Project as a direct response to this. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Global Gateway Project. So in 2023, in December, they released this document showcasing so-called key projects. This document is a joke. There's pretty much none of these projects have really been initiated. The document itself is a mess. I mean, I can only imagine how Chinese policymakers look at a document like this and say, oh my God, okay.
There's nothing in it.
Exactly. Wait, like what kind of competition do we have here? maybe not that much, right? So this is one thing, but I also think, and goes back to, is anyone listening? There are so many people that are still listening. We have friends in all types of places in Europe. We have friends in the global south that still look to us for, our norms, our values, our ideals, this way of life that we have. And this is something that China is realizing. China cannot really necessarily muster up to this level yet. They're trying, but they're having difficulties for different reasons, human rights issues and these types of things. But this is the thing, the crux of this issue is that a lot of these countries just want a better living standard. So they're using China as a kind of bridge to get to something that is like a European living standard. But Europe is still the goal at the end of the day. And I think this is something that we often underestimate.
Yeah, because you sometimes hear that people want stability, income, a decent life, and materialistically. And if that's fine, democracy is not that important. But that's not so.
But this is also, and this is another part of this, the crux of the issue is that the EU generally, and European countries generally, tend to lecture. We tend to look down on other countries that do not have the same, let's say, democratic rights, that do not have the same legal frameworks. This is one of the issues. We cannot go to these countries and not only not give them money for things they really need, and at the same time tell them you're doing everything wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong with this assumption. And this goes back to colonial thinking, I think. And this is something that we need to address. This is something that even Denmark has had its issues with. Now, Denmark is a much more pragmatic sort of actor in the EU than so many other countries, including Sweden. But still, we have to face this harsh truth, I think, that if Europe needs to have any staying power, if other countries need to like us, we need to actually be likable. We can't just go out and say, oh, you need to do this, but by the way, we're not going to give you anything for it. There has to be a give and take, and right now we're not really doing that.
Ian, you're the one that's dealing with Europe all the time. Well, you all are in different ways, but Tabita says people are still listening. We have friends all around the world who are listening. What do you boil down this to?
Yeah, I think she's absolutely right. But I think the comment about we have to consider friends as friends, lifelong friends. At the heart of the normative power concept is we have to take action in concert, together. That's not just EU member states. That's the people we're working with, the people around the world that want an alternative to what is in effect becoming a kind of a new arms race, a new Cold War. We've seen more interstate conflict in the last 5 years than we've seen since the end of the Cold War. We're in a very precarious position. And most people are saying, what's the alternative? Do we have to arm up? Do we have to accept this view of the world? No. We have to work together. And when I say we, I mean the EU and other people around the world to genuinely address what's at the root of this. Why is there an expansive sense of insecurity, of conflict, of climate change acting as an accelerant in conflict across the Sahel, across Central America? Where is this coming from? And why don't we talk about it? Why do we not hear about it? The Green New Deal the European Green Deal is a great start, but it's not going to solve it. Here in Europe's most sustainable university, we're talking about encouraging sustainability. We're not actually talking about addressing climate change in the broadest sense of that. That requires a radical rethink with our friends who are everywhere. And it may sound simple, but it's the very simple answers that provide the hardest truths. And so then we must ask ourselves, why is it we don't have this conversation? Why don't we hear this? Why aren't we taught it? Why aren't we teaching it? Yeah?
We are talking about it here tonight, and that's a start, at least for me and for you that have come here. I wish we had more time because it's wonderful to listen to you, but we don't for now. So I need to say thank you very much for you that came here, and thank you very much for watching, you that watched at home. And of course, most of all, thanks to Tabita Rosendahl, Martin Gelin, Maria Georgieva, and Ian Manners. Thank you for coming.